Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Sometimes history does not announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it arrives in the stillness of a summer afternoon, when the only sound is the buzzing of a fly against a window pane or the lazy clinking of silverware on china. It is July 12, 1979. The heat in Brooklyn is heavy, a physical weight that presses down on the rooftops and radiates off the asphalt. In the back garden of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, the air is still. There is no wind to rustle the leaves of the grapevines that crawl along the trellis overhead. There is only the sun, bright and unforgiving, bleaching the color from the red brick walls. In the center of this domestic tableau, amidst the scattered chairs and the half-eaten plates of salad, lies a man. He is older, his hair thinning and gray, his body clad in a simple leisure suit that speaks of a specific time and place. He lies on his back on the concrete patio, staring up at the blinding blue sky with eyes that see nothing. His arms are thrown out to his sides, a gesture of surrender he would never have made in life. But look closer. Look past the blood that is slowly pooling on the gray stone, dark and thick like oil. Look at his face. Clenched firmly between his teeth, defying the gravity of death itself, is a cigar. It is not just a cigar, it is a statement. It is a final, silent roar of arrogance from a man whose voice has been permanently silenced. Even as the life left his body, even as the chaos of the execution unfolded around him, his jaw remained set, his bite unbroken. He died as he lived, holding onto his vice, holding onto his image, holding onto the symbol of his power. This image, the dead man with the cigar, would travel around the world. It would be printed on the front pages of newspapers from New York to Rome. It would become the epitaph of an era, a gruesome postcard from the end of the American Mafia's golden age. But here, in the quiet of the garden, before the flashbulbs pop and the sirens wail, it is just a moment frozen in time. The sensory details of the scene are jarring in their contrast. The smell of the afternoon is a strange cocktail of the mundane and the macabre. There is the sharp, acidic tang of spilled red wine, soaking into the tablecloth and dripping onto the floor. There is the smell of tomato sauce and garlic, the comforting aromas of an Italian lunch. And cutting through it all, sharp and metallic, is the scent of gunpowder, a smell that does not belong in a garden, a smell that speaks of violence and sudden, irreversible change. The flies have already begun to gather. They buzz in lazy circles, indifferent to the tragedy, interested only in the feast. They land on the rim of a wine glass. They land on the cold hand of the man on the ground. Their droning is the only soundtrack to this scene, a low-fidelity hum that underscores the absolute silence of the dead. This man was not just a victim of a random crime. He was a Caesar in polyester. He was Carmine Galante, the cigar, the man who believed he could rule the underworld by sheer force of will. He walked through life with a sense of invincibility that bordered on delusion, convinced that he was the architect of his own destiny, immune to the laws of man and the treachery of his peers. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans. It waited for him here in this small, enclosed patio, surrounded by ivy and brick walls. It waited until he was comfortable, until his guard was down, until he felt safe enough to light that cigar and lean back in his chair. The scene asks us to pause. It asks us to look beyond the sensationalism of the mob hit and see the human fragility beneath the myth. Here is a man who commanded armies of killers, who moved millions of dollars in narcotics across oceans, who made politicians and judges tremble. And yet, here he is, reduced to a body on the ground, indistinguishable in death from any other man, save for that stubborn piece of tobacco clamped in his mouth. It is a tableau of hubris. It is a painting of the exact moment when power evaporates. One minute he was the boss of bosses, the capo dei capi, the most feared man in New York. The next, he is just a problem for the coroner to solve. The transition was instant, a shutter click of violence that severed the connection between the man and the legend. The garden is peaceful now. The shooters are gone, vanishing into the heat haze of the Brooklyn streets. The screams of the witnesses have faded into shocked silence. The world has stopped, holding its breath, waiting for the reality of what has happened to sink in. We are invited to linger here, in this uncomfortable quiet, to feel the sun on our skin, to smell the wine and the cordite, to look into the open, empty eyes of Carmine Galante. This is not just a crime scene. It is a monument to the futility of ambition. It is a reminder that no matter how high you build your tower, the ground is always waiting to catch you. The cigar remains. It is the only thing that hasn't changed. It sticks out at a defiant angle, a brown smudge against the pale skin of his face. It is a small thing, a trivial object, but in this context, it carries the weight of a lifetime. It tells us that this man was stubborn. It tells us that he was vain. It tells us that he died surprised but not afraid, or perhaps too afraid to let go of the one thing that made him feel like a king. As the shadows in the garden begin to lengthen, stretching out from the walls to touch the body, we understand that this is the end of the story. But to understand how we got here, to understand the path that led from the tenements of East Harlem to this bloody patio in Bushwick, we must go back. We must rewind the tape of history, back through the years of prison and exile, back through the smoke and the noise, to the very beginning. Because a man does not end up with a cigar in his teeth and bullets in his chest by accident. It takes a lifetime of choices, a lifetime of cruelty, and a lifetime of believing that you are the only real person in a world of ghosts. To find the seed of the man who would one day die in a Brooklyn garden, we must travel back in time. We must leave the technicolor heat of the 1970s and descend into the sepia-toned shadows of the early 20th century. We must walk the cobblestone streets of East Harlem, a neighborhood that was not yet a place, but a living, breathing organism of brick and humanity. It is 1910. The air here is thick, a palpable substance composed of coal dust, horse manure, and the simmering scent of tomato sauce drifting from 1,000 open windows. The noise is constant, a cacophony of vendors shouting the prices of fish and vegetables, mothers calling to children from fire escapes, the rattle of iron wheels on stone. It is a world of crushing density, where privacy is a myth and survival is a daily negotiation. In these tenements, families are stacked like crates in a warehouse. Laundry hangs from the fire escapes like the flags of a defeated army, gray and limp in the soot-choked air. In the winter, the cold seeps through the thin walls, settling in the bones. In the summer, the heat turns the apartments into ovens, driving the residents out onto the stoops and the rooftops in search of a breath of air. This is the crucible. This is the world that forged Camillo Teodoro Galante, Carmine. Most children born into this chaos are shaped by it. They become tough because they have to be. They steal an apple because they are hungry. They fight because they are cornered. Their criminality is a reaction, a desperate flailing against the poverty that threatens to drown them. But Carmine was different. From the very beginning, there was something in him that did not fit the narrative of the tragic victim. He was not a boy pushed into darkness. He was a boy who found the darkness comfortable. He was quiet, watchful, with eyes that seemed to absorb the violence of the streets without reflecting any emotion back. While other children played stickball in the alleys, laughing and shouting, Carmine moved with a strange, predatory stillness. He watched the older boys, the toughs who ran the corners. He didn't admire them for their clothes or their money. He admired them for their power. He saw how fear worked. He saw that if you hit someone hard enough, they didn't just stop fighting, they stopped being a person. They became an object you could control. The records of his youth read like a map of a descent. By the age of 10, he was already known to the authorities, not for stealing bread, but for violence that seemed disproportionate to the provocation. He was sent to reformatories, those grim, Victorian institutions designed to break the spirit of wayward boys. But you cannot break something that is already hard. In the Brooklyn Disciplinary Training School, surrounded by the smell of boiled cabbage and the sound of weeping children, Carmine did not cry. He observed. He learned the hierarchy of the cage. He learned that the guards were just another gang, one with uniforms and keys. He learned that mercy was a weakness, a crack in the armor that let the knife in. The psychiatric evaluations from this period are chilling documents. They describe a boy who is neurologically and mentally dull, a phrase that in the parlance of the time meant something far more sinister than stupidity. It meant a lack of affect. It meant an emptiness where the conscience should be. One report noted an emotional flatness, so profound it unsettled the doctors. They looked into his eyes and saw a void. He was, in effect, a machine built for the underworld. He had no empathy to slow him down, no guilt to keep him awake at night. He was a perfect sociopath, born into a time and place that rewarded sociopathy with respect. As he grew, the streets of East Harlem became his hunting ground. He didn't just survive the neighborhood, he mastered it. He joined gangs not for camaraderie but for leverage. He was small in stature, physically unimposing, but he carried himself with a terrifying density. When he walked into a room, the temperature seemed to drop. People learned to give him space, not out of courtesy, but out of instinct. The same instinct that tells a gazelle to freeze when a lion enters the clearing. He was known for his temper, a flash fire of rage that could ignite over a spilled drink or a disrespectful glance. But beneath the temper was something colder, the ice in his veins. He could scream and shout, yes, but he could also wait. He could plan. He could look a man in the face, smile, and then slide a knife between his ribs without his pulse rising by a single beat. This duality, the fire and the ice, became his trademark. It made him unpredictable and therefore dangerous. You never knew which Carmine you were dealing with, the hot-headed street thug or the cold-blooded executioner. And by the time you figured it out, it was usually too late. The immigrant experience in New York was a story of struggle, of families trying to claw their way up to the light. But Carmine Galante didn't want the light. He preferred the shadows. He saw the law-abiding citizens, the men who worked 18 hours a day in factories to feed their children, as suckers. Why work for pennies when you could take dollars? Why follow the rules when the people making the rules were just as corrupt as you were? He rejected the path of the immigrant striver. He chose the path of the predator. And East Harlem, with its labyrinth of alleys and its code of silence, was the perfect ecosystem for him. It protected him. It hid him. It fed him. By the time he was a young man, the die was cast. The boy who had watched the streets with dead eyes had become a man who made the streets watch him. He had no fear of prison, no fear of God, no fear of death. He was a creature of pure will, moving through the chaotic growth of New York City like a shark moving through water, silent, efficient, and always, always hungry. The shadows of East Harlem stretched long in the afternoons, covering the sidewalks in gloom. But for Carmine Galante, the shadows were not something to fear. They were home, and he was just beginning to explore how deep they went. Geography often dictates destiny. For most men of his ilk, the world ended at the bridges and tunnels of New York City. The 5 boroughs were the universe, and anything beyond them was a foreign, unknowable land. But Carmine Galante was not most men. His ambition was not contained by city limits or state lines. It spilled over, cold and relentless, pushing north, away from the familiar heat of the city and into the biting chill of a new frontier. It is the 1950s. The setting shifts dramatically. Gone are the claustrophobic canyons of East Harlem, smelling of garbage and humanity. In their place is the expansive gray landscape of Montreal. Here the air is different. It is sharper, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. The winter wind howls off the St. Lawrence River, cutting through wool coats and settling deep in the marrow. The snow falls in silence, blanketing the city in white, muffling the sounds of the streets. It is a world of stark contrasts, black trees against white fields, warm breath against cold air. This environment suited Galante perfectly. The cold mirrored his own internal temperature. The silence of the snow reflected his preference for quiet, efficient operation. He did not come to Canada as a tourist. He came as a colonizer. He came as a CEO of the underworld, tasked with a project that would change the face of crime forever. This was the era of the French Connection. While the other families in New York fought over gambling rackets and union dues, scraps from the table, Galante was looking at the ocean. He saw the potential for a bridge, a pipeline of narcotics that would connect the poppy fields of Turkey to the laboratories of Marseille, and finally, to the veins of America. And Montreal was the gateway. The atmosphere of this exile was one of industrial precision. Galante moved through the city not like a gangster, but like a logistics expert. There were no flashy shootouts here, no bodies left in the street to send a message. Instead, there were meetings. Long, quiet meetings in the back rooms of social clubs where the air was thick with the smoke of galloises and the murmur of French and Italian dialects intermingling. He sat across from Corsican mobsters, men with hard faces and scarred hands, and negotiated deals that would move tons of heroin across the Atlantic. He inspected warehouses near the docks, walking through the cavernous spaces with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning for weaknesses, for opportunities. He watched the ships come in, hulking steel beasts breaking through the ice of the river, carrying cargo that was worth more than gold. The scale of his ambition was breathtaking. He wasn't just organizing a crime, he was building an infrastructure. He was creating a global supply chain. He understood that the real power didn't lie in the muscle on the street corner, it lay in the control of the product. If you controlled the heroin, you controlled the market. If you controlled the market, you controlled the families back home. In Montreal, Galante grew into his legend. He was far from the prying eyes of the NYPD, far from the petty squabbles of the New York Commission. He was a ghost in a foreign land, operating in the shadows of a city that didn't yet know how to fear him. He traveled under false names, moved through airports with the ease of a diplomat, a figure of international mystery. This is where the cigar became more than just a habit. It became a part of his anatomy. In every meeting, in every photograph from this time, the cigar is there. It is clenched between his teeth as he steps out of a car. It is held in his hand as he points at a map. It is a constant presence, a chimney for the fire that burned inside him. He breathed in the smoke of his own empire, exhaling it into the cold Canadian air, watching it dissipate like the lives of the addicts he was feeding. The packing of these years was slow, methodical. Wealth accumulated not in sudden bursts, but in a steady, rising tide. Cash flowed into safety deposit boxes, into real estate, into businesses used to wash the stain from the money. Galante became a wealthy man, but his hunger did not abate. If anything, the cold of the north only preserved it, kept it fresh. He was building a kingdom of ice and powder. He was turning the addiction of strangers into a monument to his own cleverness. He viewed the heroin trade with a chilling detachment. He didn't see the misery it caused. He saw the demand. He saw a market waiting to be serviced. He was simply the man with the supply. But even in exile, the connections to home remained. He sent money back to New York, tribute to the Bonanno family, ensuring his place at the table was kept warm. He was the golden goose laying eggs in the snow. His reputation grew. Stories drifted south, stories of his ruthlessness, his efficiency, his terrifying calm. He was becoming a myth, a boogeyman who lived in the north and pulled the strings of the drug trade with icy fingers. The border was just a line on a map to him, a fiction that could be erased with the right bribe or the right route. He moved his product through the porous boundary between Canada and the United States, flooding New York with high-grade heroin. The stuff on the streets got stronger, the lines of addicts got longer, and the money piled higher. Galante stood on the docks of Montreal, watching the gray water of the St. Lawrence churn. He pulled the collar of his coat up against the wind. He lit another cigar, the flame flaring briefly in the gloom. He was master of all he surveyed. He had turned the exile into an empire. He had proven that he was not just a New York tough guy. He was a man of the world. But empires built on poison have a way of poisoning the emperor. The success of the French Connection brought heat. It brought the attention of federal agencies who were beginning to see the pattern in the snow. The silence of the North was not empty. It was listening. And as Galante plotted his return to the sun, the shadows he had cast were already beginning to lengthen, reaching out to drag him back down to earth. For now, though, he was the king of the North, a man of smoke and ice, standing alone in the cold, waiting for his moment to conquer the world. For most men, prison is a tomb. It is a place where ambition goes to die, buried under layers of concrete and paperwork. It is a slow suffocation, a world where the horizon is replaced by a wall and the future shrinks down to the next meal. But for Carmine Galante, the penitentiary was not a grave. It was a freezer. He entered the system in the early 1960s, a king stripped of his crown but not his kingdom. The gates of Louisbourg and later other federal institutions closed behind him with a finality that would have broken a lesser spirit. The sound of a prison gate is unique in the lexicon of human noise. It is a heavy, metallic boom that reverberates in the chest, vibrating with the absolute authority of the state. It is the sound of the world ending. Inside, the sensory landscape is stripped bare. The colors are muted, gray steel, beige paint, the faded blue of uniforms. The smells are institutional, the sharp sting of bleach, the musty odor of old books in the library, the faint, persistent scent of thousands of men living in close quarters. The air is recycled, stale, devoid of the complex aromas of the outside world. But Galante did not shrink in this environment. He expanded. In the stark, echoing reality of the cell block, he found a new kind of power. Stripped of his suits, his cars, and his women, he was left with only the raw force of his personality. And it turned out that was enough. He walked the yard not with the shuffle of an inmate, but with the stride of a landlord inspecting his property. Other prisoners, men who had killed with their bare hands, men who feared nothing, stepped aside when he passed. They saw something in his eyes that terrified them. It was a total absence of submission. Most men in prison are broken or they are hiding. Galante was neither. He was waiting. He held court in the corners of the exercise yard, surrounded by a phalanx of loyalists who would have died for a nod of approval. He settled disputes. He authorized loans. He ordered punishments. The guards, the men with the keys and the guns, watched him warily from their towers. They knew the hierarchy of the prison was a polite fiction. They ran the schedule, but Galante ran the population. There are stories from this time, whispered legends of his dominance. Stories of guards who crossed him and found their cars burned in the parking lot. Stories of other bosses who bowed to him, acknowledging his seniority. He was the cigar, even when he couldn't smoke, chewing on the unlit tobacco like a talisman, his jaw set in a permanent grimace of defiance. But beneath the surface, beneath the show of strength, something else was happening. The years were passing. The seasons changed outside the walls, spring rain turning to summer heat, autumn leaves giving way to winter snow. But inside, time stood still. We must delve into the mind of the man during these lost years. What happens to a sociopath when he is denied his prey? What happens to a conqueror when his battlefield is reduced to a few acres of concrete? Resentment festered in the dark. It grew like a fungus in the damp corners of his soul. He watched the news from the outside world. He saw the mafia changing. He saw the old codes eroding, replaced by greed and flashy incompetence. He saw men he considered inferiors, Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, rising to power while he sat in a cage. He hated them. He hated the commission that had left him to rot. He hated the government that had locked him away. This hatred became his fuel. It kept him warm in the cold nights. It kept him sharp. He spent his days plotting, replaying old scores in his head, calculating the interest on debts of blood. He refused to break. He refused to show a single crack in the armor. To the other inmates, he was a statue carved from granite. He never complained. He never showed weakness. He never spoke of regret. He was Lilo, the impenetrable, the unknowable. The packing of his life slowed to the agonizing drag of prison time. A day felt like a week. A week felt like a month. The routine was relentless. The count, the chow hall, the work detail, the count again. It was a rhythm designed to crush the will, to turn men into automatons. But Galante used the routine as a meditation. He used the silence of his cell to sharpen his mind. He studied the law, looking for loopholes. He studied his enemies, looking for weaknesses. He became a scholar of revenge. He was preserved in his own malice, like a specimen in a jar of formaldehyde. The world outside was spinning faster and faster, the chaos of the 60s, the disillusionment of the 70s. But inside the freezer, Carmine Galante remained unchanged. He was a relic of a harder, colder era, protected from the erosion of time by the thickness of the walls. He was a time bomb that had been paused. The timer was stuck at 1 second to midnight. The explosive potential was still there, dormant but potent, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. He knew, with the certainty of a fanatic, that he would not die in prison. He knew that the doors would eventually open, and when they did, he would step out into the sun not as a reformed man, not as a broken old convict, but as a plague. He would unleash the accumulated rage of a decade upon the city that had forgotten him. He waited. He watched the shadows move across the floor of his cell. He chewed on his cigar. And in the silence of the lockdown, when the lights went out and the only sound was the breathing of 1,000 sleeping men, Carmine Galante smiled, because he knew that every day that passed was one day closer to the reckoning. The freezer could hold his body, but it could not freeze his ambition. That burned hot, a pilot light in the darkness, ready to ignite the world the moment the oxygen rushed back in. The doors opened in 1974. Carmine Galante stepped out of the timeless void of prison and into a world that had aged without him. But it had not aged gracefully. The New York City he returned to was not the glittering metropolis of the post-war boom, nor the disciplined, segregated world of the 1950s. It was a city on its knees. They called it Fear City. It was a kingdom of rust and graffiti, a giant, crumbling machine that seemed on the verge of shaking itself apart. Imagine the sensory shock of his return. The air smelled different, thicker, laced with the acrid scent of uncollected garbage rotting in the strikes, the exhaust of 1,000,000 cars idling in gridlock, the sweet, cloying odor of marijuana smoke drifting from street corners. The subways were no longer just transport. They were moving canvases of spray paint, screeching through tunnels that felt dangerous and lawless. The city was broke, bordering on bankruptcy, vibrating with a nervous, frantic energy. The old order was fraying. The mafia, once a monolithic structure of silence and respect, was beginning to crack. The old lions were dying. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, cunning don who had held the peace, was in his final years. The commission was unstable, a table with uneven legs, wobbling under the weight of new money and new greed. Most men, emerging from a decade of confinement into this chaotic landscape, would be overwhelmed. They would be dinosaurs blinking at the meteors, confused by the noise and the disrespect. But Galante was not confused. He looked at the decay and he saw opportunity. He looked at the disorder and he saw a vacuum waiting to be filled. He moved through the city not like a tourist, but like a predator re-entering its territory. He was a shark swimming in dirty water, and dirty water is where the hunting is best. He toured his old neighborhoods in Little Italy and East Harlem. He saw the changes. The old social clubs were still there, but the paint was peeling. The wise guys standing out front wore wider lapels and longer hair, and their eyes darted around with a drug-fueled paranoia that disgusted him. He smelled the weakness on them. They were soft. They had forgotten the discipline of the old country. They were too busy trying to be celebrities to remember how to be soldiers. Galante walked these streets with a terrifying, steady gait. He was shorter than most, balding, bespectacled, looking for all the world like a retired grandfather. But when he stopped to light his cigar, the flame illuminating his face for a brief second, the young toughs fell silent. They sensed the density of the man. They sensed the history of violence that radiated off him like heat from a radiator. His hunger was palpable. After years of prison food, of steel trays and lukewarm coffee, he wanted to feast. He didn't just want money, he had plenty of that stashed away. He didn't just want respect, he wanted the crown. He wanted to be the capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. He believed it was his birthright, stolen from him by lesser men while he sat in a cage. The emotional focus of this period is one of pure, unadulterated entitlement. Galante looked at the commission, at the polished, careful men like Paul Castellano, and he sneered. He saw them as businessmen playing at being gangsters. He was a gangster. He was the real thing, forged in the fires of the 1930s, hardened in the freezer of the penitentiary. He believed he was the only one left who understood the true nature of power, that it is taken, not given. He began to test the fences. He reached out to his old contacts, the men who had stayed loyal, the ghosts from the past. He started to reclaim his rackets, pushing aside the caretakers who had watched over them in his absence. He did it with a brutal lack of subtlety. A message sent here, a beating there, a sudden disappearance. He was announcing his return with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The packing of the city was erratic, a jagged rhythm of disco beats and sirens. But Galante moved to his own tempo. He was steady, menacing, stalking the power vacuum with the patience of a man who has waited 10 years for this moment. He didn't try to adapt to the new New York. He didn't buy a leisure suit or go to Studio 54. He wore his old clothes. He smoked his old cigars. He spoke in the old dialects. He was an anachronism, a ghost from a harder time, haunting the ruins of the modern world. But ghosts are dangerous because they cannot be killed. He looked at the crumbling skyline, the graffiti-covered trains, the garbage piled on the sidewalks, and he didn't see ruin. He saw a kingdom in rust, and he knew that rust could be scraped away. He knew that beneath the dirt, the iron was still there, and he intended to forge it into a throne. This was the calm before the storm. The other families watched him with growing unease. They saw the look in his eyes, the cold, dead stare of the sociopath, and they shivered. They knew that the peace of the Gambino era was over. They knew that the cigar was back, and he was ready to burn the whole city down just to light his way to the top. The stage was set. The players were in position. The city held its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall on the cracked pavement. And Carmine Galante, standing in the shadows of Mulberry Street, struck a match. In the ecology of the underworld, there is a delicate balance. It is a closed system, ruled by families who have lived on the same blocks for generations, who share a common language, a common history, and a common set of rules. They know each other's mothers. They know each other's sins. But Carmine Galante, in his hunger for absolute control, decided to disrupt this ecosystem. He introduced an invasive species. He imported an army. They came from the hills of Sicily, from the dusty villages of Castellamare del Golfo. They were called the Zips, a derogatory slang born from the speed of their speech, the rapid-fire Sicilian dialects that sounded like gibberish to the ears of the Americanized mobsters. But to Galante, they were not Zips. They were Spartans. The cultural clash was immediate and jarring. The American wise guys of the 1970s had become soft, enamored with their own celebrity. They wore silk suits with wide lapels, drove Cadillacs with plush interiors, and spent their nights in disco clubs, chasing women and the limelight. They were flashy. They were loud. They were recognizable. The Sicilians were none of these things. Imagine walking into a social club on Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick during this time. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp, bitter scent of espresso. In the front, the locals are laughing, playing cards, shouting in Brooklyn accents. But in the back, in the shadows, sit the ghosts. They wear cheap sweaters and ill-fitting trousers. They drink their coffee black and short. They do not laugh. They do not mix. They sit in silence or speak in hushed, guttural tones that even the other Italians cannot decipher. Their eyes are cold, unreadable, ancient. They look at the Americans with a mixture of confusion and disdain. These men had no connection to New York. They had no families here to protect, no childhood friends to betray them. They were untethered from the social fabric of the city. Their loyalty was not to a flag or a neighborhood or a crew. Their loyalty was a straight, unbroken line that led directly to one man, Carmine Galante. To the other families, the presence of these men was deeply unsettling. It was eerie. It felt like a violation of the natural order. Galante was surrounding himself with ghosts, men who could kill without hesitation and vanish without a trace. They were an army that existed outside the rules of engagement. You couldn't negotiate with them because you couldn't speak to them. You couldn't threaten their families because their families were thousands of miles away, in stone houses in the Mediterranean sun. Galante used them as his personal Praetorian guard. They lived in his house. They drove his car. They slept outside his door. He trusted them because they were foreigners in a strange land, dependent entirely on him for their survival. He believed this made him safe. He believed he had built a wall of silence around himself that no American treachery could penetrate. But isolation is a double-edged sword. By bringing in the Zips, Galante was not just protecting himself. He was alienating himself. He was signaling to the other bosses, to the Gambinos, the Genovese, the Lucchis, that he did not trust them. He was telling them that he viewed himself as separate, superior, a king who needed foreign mercenaries to police his own subjects. The atmosphere in the city grew heavier with their arrival. There was a creeping dread on the streets. If you saw a Cadillac full of guys in tracksuits, you knew what to expect. You knew the rules. But if you saw a beat-up sedan filled with men in wool sweaters, men with dark eyes and silent mouths, you felt a different kind of fear. It was the fear of the unknown. Galante reveled in this fear. He walked through the city with his ghosts flanking him, a smirk playing around the cigar in his mouth. He felt untouchable. He didn't see the resentment building in the eyes of his own captains. He didn't see that by elevating these outsiders, he was insulting the very men he needed to hold his empire together. The sensory details of this era are marked by this divide. The hissed whispers in the back of the cafes, the smell of old wool and strong tobacco, the sound of an espresso machine screaming steam into a cup, masking the sound of a conspiracy being hatched in a dialect as old as the hills. Galante thought he was building a fortress. In reality, he was digging a moat. And while a moat keeps enemies out, it also keeps allies away. It leaves you on an island, alone with your ghosts. And ghosts, by their very nature, belong to the dead. They are comfortable in the dark. They are patient. The other families watched. They waited. They saw the army of strangers taking over the heroin trade, taking over the enforcement, taking over the streets. And they realized that Galante was not just a problem. He was an existential threat. He was trying to turn the American Mafia back into the Sicilian Mafia. He was trying to reverse history. But time only moves in one direction. And in New York City, in the dying days of the 1970s, there was no room for ghosts. The city was a machine of concrete and steel, and it demanded flesh and blood. Galante's army was formidable, yes, but an army is only as strong as the loyalty of the men holding the weapons. And in the underworld, loyalty is a commodity that fluctuates with the market. As the winter winds blew down Knickerbocker Avenue, rattling the windows of the social clubs, the Zips sat in the back, drinking their coffee, watching the door. They were ready to kill for their boss, but they were also watching him. They were learning the city. They were learning the game. And in the silence of their exile, they were beginning to realize that in America, even a king can bleed. There is a moment in the trajectory of every tyrant where ambition crosses the line into madness. It is the moment when the hunger for power ceases to be a means to an end and becomes an end in itself. For Carmine Galante, that moment arrived in the late 1970s when he looked out at the sprawling, chaotic landscape of the New York underworld and decided that he was not just a player in the game. He was the game. He declared himself the Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses. It was a title that belonged to a bygone era, a relic of the ancient Sicilian codes that the American Mafia had long since abandoned in favor of the committee-based rule of the commission. To claim, it was an act of supreme arrogance. It was a challenge thrown in the face of every other don in the city. But Galante didn't care. He believed he had the muscle to back it up. He believed he had the money to buy the world. And oh, the money. It was a river, it was a flood. With the Zips enforcing his will and the French Connection pipeline pumping at full capacity, Galante took total control of the heroin trade. He didn't just participate in it, he monopolized it. He shut down the independent operators. He squeezed the other families out. He turned the spigot until every drop of narcotic revenue flowed into his own pockets. Imagine the sheer physical scale of this wealth. In the basements of unremarkable houses in Queens and Brooklyn, money was being counted not by hand, but by machine. The whirring of bill counters was the soundtrack of the operation, a ceaseless, rhythmic ticking that measured success in stacks of green paper. Duffel bags, heavy and bulging, were dragged across concrete floors. Safes were filled until the doors wouldn't close. Walls were hollowed out to create vaults. It was a staggering fortune, enough to buy islands, enough to buy governments. But Galante hoarded it. He refused to share. In the Mafia, tribute is the glue that holds the structure together. You kick up to the boss kicks across to the other families, and everyone eats. But Galante broke the compact. He kept it all. He walked through Little Italy like a visiting monarch. He expected the reverence of a pope. When he entered a restaurant, the conversation stopped. Men stood up. They bowed their heads. They kissed his ring. He sat at the best tables, puffing on his cigar, surrounded by his silent Sicilian guards, drinking in the adulation. But beneath the surface of this decadent display, the tension was unbearable. The air was heavy, charged with the static electricity of a coming storm. We must look past the swagger and into the eyes of the men watching him. The other bosses, Paul Castellano of the Gambinos, Funzi Thierry of the Genovese, looked on with a mixture of fear and loathing. They saw a man who had broken the rules that kept them all safe. They saw a man who was bringing too much heat, too much attention, too much chaos. Galante's greed had blinded him. It is a peculiar blindness that affects the powerful. It narrows the field of vision until all you can see is what you possess, not what you are losing. He thought the money made him invulnerable. He thought that because he was the richest, he was the strongest. He forgot that in his world, money is not just currency, it is blood. And by keeping it all, he was starving the very wolves that were circling his campfire. The psychology of his hubris is fascinating and terrifying. He truly believed he was bigger than the institution. He believed he was the second coming of Lucky Luciano or Al Capone. He dismissed the commission as a group of old women arguing over pennies. He was a man of action. He was a man of destiny. But destiny is a fickle writer. Every dollar he kept for himself was another nail in his coffin. Every time he refused to kick up a share of the heroin profits, he sharpened the invisible knives behind his back. The grumblings in the social clubs grew louder. The whispers in the backrooms turned into conversations. The conversations turned into plans. Galante built a tower of gold, brick by golden brick. It rose high above the city, gleaming in the sun, a testament to his genius, but he built it on a foundation of resentment. And resentment is unstable ground. It shifts, it cracks, it waits for the right tremor to bring the whole structure crashing down. He seemed oblivious, wrapped in the thick, pungent smoke of his cigar, insulated by his language barrier with the zips. He couldn't hear the sound of the foundation cracking. He couldn't feel the vibrations in the floor. He was too busy counting his money. He was too busy being the boss of bosses. There is a tragic precariousness to his position. We, the observers, can see the cliff edge he is walking toward. We can see the fall that is coming. But he marches on, head held high, eyes fixed on a horizon that he will never reach. He wore his crown of thorns proudly, mistaking the pain for power. He didn't realize that the thorns were cutting him, bleeding him dry, leaving a trail for the sharks to follow. He was the richest man in the graveyard, a king sitting on a throne that was already burning. The city watched, the families watched, the feds watched, and Carmine Galante, the man who thought he could own the world, simply lit another cigar and smiled, unaware that the smoke was clouding his vision of the end. While Carmine Galante paraded through Little Italy like a conquering emperor, a different kind of work was being done in the shadows. It was quiet work. It was careful work. It was the work of consensus, of building a coalition of knives that would eventually plunge into the heart of the man who thought he was untouchable. The conspiracy against the cigar did not begin with a shout of anger. It began with a whisper. We must leave the bright, smoky rooms where Galante held court and descend into the backrooms of his enemies. These were places that smelled of old wood, stale beer, and secrets. In the social clubs of the Gambino family in Brooklyn, in the quiet restaurants of the Genovese family in Manhattan, men were gathering. They sat in semicircles, their faces obscured by low light, speaking in the coded language of their trade. He's a problem, one would say, swirling the ice in his scotch. He's eating alone, another would reply, tapping ash into a tray. The dialogue of betrayal is rarely dramatic. It is bureaucratic. It is the language of a board of directors discussing a CEO who has become a liability. Galante was bad for business. His greed was destabilizing the market. His arrogance was drawing too much attention. His refusal to share the heroin profits was a violation of the fundamental contract of the commission. The decision was not made lightly. In the world of Cosa Nostra, killing a boss is a nuclear option. It requires approval. It requires unanimity. If you strike at a king, you must not miss, and you must have the support of the other kingdoms. The messengers were dispatched. They traveled to prisons to speak with incarcerated leaders, whispering through plexiglass or passing notes in the yard. They traveled to Florida to speak with retired dons. The question was always the same: can we proceed? And the answer was always a slow, solemn nod. But the true treachery, the knife that cuts the deepest, always comes from within the family. The plot against Galante required an inside man. It required someone close to him, someone he trusted, someone who could open the gates from the inside. The conspirators turned their gaze toward the Bonanno family itself. They looked at the captains who had been sidelined by Galante, the men who had been disrespected, the men who were tired of watching the money flow upstream and never trickle down. We explore the perspective of these men. They were not traitors in their own eyes. They were survivors. They saw the writing on the wall. They knew that if they didn't move against Galante, the other families would move against the entire Bonanno clan. It was a choice between loyalty to a tyrant and the survival of the tribe. The sensory details of these meetings are suffocating. The air is thick with smoke, stinging the eyes. The clinking of glasses sounds loud in the heavy silence. The glances exchanged across the table carry the weight of life and death. A handshake here is not a greeting. It is a contract for murder. The most chilling aspect of the conspiracy was the subversion of the zips. Galante's Praetorian Guard, the men he had imported for their loyalty, were turned against him. It was a masterstroke of intelligence. The conspirators reached out to the Sicilian bosses back in Italy. They explained the situation. They made deals. And from thousands of miles away, the order came down. Step aside. The Zips, those silent ghosts who lived in Galante's shadow, shifted their allegiance. They didn't announce it. They didn't change their behavior. They continued to drive his car, to light his cigars, to stand guard outside his door. But they were no longer his men. They were the executioners in waiting. Galante went about his daily routine, blissfully unaware of the net tightening around him. He walked the streets, ate his meals, counted his money. He didn't see the subtle shifts in the eyes of the men around him. He didn't hear the silence that fell when he entered a room. He was deafened by his own ego. There is a profound tension in watching a man walk toward a trap that he cannot see. It is the tension of the predator stalking the prey, but in this case, the prey believes he is the lion. Galante thought he was surrounded by a wall of steel. In reality, he was surrounded by a curtain of paper, ready to be torn away at any moment. The dangerous weapon in the mob is not the shotgun or the pistol. It is the consensus. It is the moment when everyone agrees that you must die. Once that agreement is reached, the act itself is just a formality. The trigger has already been pulled. The bullet just hasn't arrived yet. As the summer of 1979 approached, the whispers turned into a plan. A date was set. A location was chosen. The knives were sharpened in the dark, their edges glinting in the dim light of the backrooms. The conspiracy was complete. It was a machine built of resentment and greed, oiled with treachery, and aimed squarely at the heart of the cigar. And Carmine Galante, the man who thought he could outsmart the world, was just days away from finding out that in a room full of knives, the one you don't see is the one that kills you. While Carmine Galante paraded through Little Italy like a conquering emperor, a different kind of work was being done in the shadows. It was quiet work. It was careful work. It was the work of consensus, of building a coalition of knives that would eventually plunge into the heart of the man who thought he was untouchable. The conspiracy against the cigar did not begin with a shout of anger. It began with a whisper. We must leave the bright, smoky rooms where Galante held court and descend into the backrooms of his enemies. These were places that smelled of old wood, stale beer, and secrets. In the social clubs of the Gambino family in Brooklyn, in the quiet restaurants of the Genovese family in Manhattan, men were gathering. They sat in semicircles, their faces obscured by low light, speaking in the coded language of their trade. He's a problem, one would say, swirling the ice in his scotch. He's eating alone, another would reply, tapping ash into a tray. The dialogue of betrayal is rarely dramatic. It is bureaucratic. It is the language of a board of directors discussing a CEO who has become a liability. Galante was bad for business. His greed was destabilizing the market. His arrogance was drawing too much attention. His refusal to share the heroin profits was a violation of the fundamental contract of the commission. The decision was not made lightly. In the world of Cosa Nostra, killing a boss is a nuclear option. It requires approval. It requires unanimity. If you strike at a king, you must not miss, and you must have the support of the other kingdoms. The messengers were dispatched. They traveled to prisons to speak with incarcerated leaders, whispering through plexiglass or passing notes in the yard. They traveled to Florida to speak with retired dons. The question was always the same: can we proceed? And the answer was always a slow, solemn nod. But the true treachery, the knife that cuts the deepest, always comes from within the family. The plot against Galante required an inside man. It required someone close to him, someone he trusted, someone who could open the gates from the inside. The conspirators turned their gaze toward the Bonanno family itself. They looked at the captains who had been sidelined by Galante, the men who had been disrespected, the men who were tired of watching the money flow upstream and never trickle down. We explore the perspective of these men. They were not traitors in their own eyes. They were survivors. They saw the writing on the wall. They knew that if they didn't move against Galante, the other families would move against the entire Bonanno clan. It was a choice between loyalty to a tyrant and the survival of the tribe. The sensory details of these meetings are suffocating. The air is thick with smoke, stinging the eyes. The clinking of glasses sounds loud in the heavy silence. The glances exchanged across the table carry the weight of life and death. A handshake here is not a greeting, it is a contract for murder. The most chilling aspect of the conspiracy was the subversion of the Zips. Galante's Praetorian Guard, the men he had imported for their loyalty, were turned against him. It was a masterstroke of intelligence. The conspirators reached out to the Sicilian bosses back in Italy. They explained the situation. They made deals. And from thousands of miles away, the order came down. Step aside. The Zips, those silent ghosts who lived in Galante's shadow, shifted their allegiance. They didn't announce it. They didn't change their behavior. They continued to drive his car, to light his cigars, to stand guard outside his door. But they were no longer his men. They were the executioners in waiting. Galante went about his daily routine, blissfully unaware of the net tightening around him. He walked the streets, ate his meals, counted his money. He didn't see the subtle shifts in the eyes of the men around him. He didn't hear the silence that fell when he entered a room. He was deafened by his own ego. There is a profound tension in watching a man walk toward a trap that he cannot see. It is the tension of the predator stalking the prey, but in this case, the prey believes he is the lion. Galante thought he was surrounded by a wall of steel. In reality, he was surrounded by a curtain of paper, ready to be torn away at any moment. The dangerous weapon in the mob is not the shotgun or the pistol. It is the consensus. It is the moment when everyone agrees that you must die. Once that agreement is reached, the act itself is just a formality. The trigger has already been pulled. The bullet just hasn't arrived yet. As the summer of 1979 approached, the whispers turned into a plan. A date was set. A location was chosen. The knives were sharpened in the dark, their edges glinting in the dim light of the backrooms. The conspiracy was complete. It was a machine built of resentment and greed, oiled with treachery, and aimed squarely at the heart of the cigar. And Carmine Galante, the man who thought he could outsmart the world, was just days away from finding out that in a room full of knives, the one you don't see is the one that kills you. Time bends in the final moments of a life. It stretches and warps, turning seconds into hours, allowing us to examine the intricate details of the end with a clarity that the living rarely possess. We return now to where we began, to the enclosed patio of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. It is the early afternoon of July 12, 1979. The sun is at its zenith, a blinding white disk that bleaches the color from the brick walls and turns the concrete floor into a radiator. The heat is oppressive, a humid blanket that smells of asphalt and exhaust from the street beyond, mixing with the more immediate, intimate sense of the garden. There is the sharp, acidic tang of vinaigrette dressing, the earthy aroma of the grapevines twisting overhead, their leaves still and heavy in the stagnant air, the smell of cheap red wine breathing in open carafes. Carmine Galante sits at a table covered in a red and white checkered cloth. To an observer, this is a scene of utter banality, a grandfather enjoying a lunch in the shade. He is eating a salad, his fork spearing crisp lettuce and tomatoes, the oil glistening on his chin. He wipes his mouth with a paper napkin. He reaches for his wine glass, his fingers leaving a smudge on the rim. He is relaxed. This is the most dangerous state for a man in his position. For decades, Galante lived on the edge of a knife, his senses sharpened by paranoia, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter. But here, surrounded by his cousins, his hosts, and his Praetorian Guard of Sicilian Zips, he has allowed the armor to slip. He believes he is protected by the ultimate shield, his own legend. He believes that no one would dare. The conversation at the table is trivial. They are not discussing heroin shipments or commission politics. They are talking about the food. They are talking about the heat. They are talking about nothing. It is the small talk of men who believe they have all the time in the world. Galante finishes his meal. He pushes the plate away, a gesture of satisfaction. He reaches into his pocket and withdraws a cigar. It is a ritual he has performed thousands of times, a reflex as natural as breathing. He cuts the end. He strikes a match, shielding the flame with a cupped hand, and draws the smoke deep into his lungs. He exhales a cloud of blue-gray smoke that hangs in the still air, drifting slowly up toward the trellis. He leans back in his metal chair, the legs scraping faintly against the concrete. He clamps the cigar between his teeth, jutting his jaw forward. In this moment, he is the picture of contentment. He is the boss of bosses, digesting his kingdom along with his lunch. He does not hear the car pulling up to the curb out front. He does not hear the doors opening. The transition from domestic calm to violent chaos is not gradual. It is instantaneous. It is a shattering of reality. 3 men enter the garden from the rear door of the restaurant. In the heat of July, they are wearing ski masks and heavy coats. The absurdity of the image strikes the brain before the danger does. It looks like a mistake, a hallucination brought on by the sun. But the weapons in their hands are real. Shotguns, pistols, tools of erasure. The atmosphere in the garden changes physically. The air seems to crystallize. The buzzing of the flies stops. The banal conversation is cut off mid-sentence. Galante looks up. His eyes, behind his glasses, register the shapes. Does he understand? Does the computer in his mind, the one that calculated odds and risks for 50 years, finally output the error message? Or is he simply surprised? The betrayal happens in the silence before the noise. Cesar Bonventure and Baldo Amato, the Zips, the loyal bodyguard standing watch, do not reach for their weapons. They do not shout a warning. They do not throw themselves in front of their boss. They simply step back. It is a small movement, a shuffle of feet on the concrete, but it is the loudest action in the history of the American Mafia. It is the physical manifestation of the conspiracy we watch take shape in the shadows. They are not surprised by the gunmen. They are expecting them. The wall of silence Galante built around himself has not just crumbled. It has turned into a prison. The men he trusted, the men he imported because they had no allegiance to America, have proven that their only allegiance is to the winning side. Then the noise. The roar of a shotgun in an enclosed space is deafening. It is a physical blow that rattles the teeth and stuns the senses. 1 shot, 2, 3. The sound echoes off the brick walls, amplifying the violence, turning the garden into a slaughterhouse. Galante is thrown backward. The physics of the event are brutal and undignified. The force of the blasts knocks him from his chair. He tumbles to the ground, his arms flailing, his legs twisting. The wine carafe shatters, spraying red liquid across the patio, mingling with the darker red that is now pumping from his chest. It is over in seconds. The gunmen do not linger. There are no speeches. No, this is for the family. There is only the professional efficiency of men doing a job. They turn and exit the way they came, stepping over the debris of the lunch, holstering their weapons as they walk back out into the sunlit street. The Zips, the betrayers, walk out with them. They leave the man who brought them to America, the man who gave them everything, lying alone on the concrete. They leave him to the heat and the silence. And now we are back to the image that started it all. The dust settles. The smoke from the shotgun blast drifts up to mix with the smoke from the cigar. The silence rushes back into the garden, heavier than before. It is a stunned silence, the world pausing to process the sudden absence of a titan. Carmine Galante lies on his back. His eyes are open, staring up at the trellis, at the patch of blue sky visible through the leaves. He looks small. Without the fear he inspired, without the aura of power, he is just an old man in a cheap suit who has met a violent end. But the cigar, it is still there, clenched firmly in the corner of his mouth. It didn't fall out when he was hit. It didn't fall out when he hit the ground. It remains, a stubborn brown exclamation point at the end of his life sentence. It is a detail that feels scripted, too perfect for reality. It captures the essence of the man better than any biography could. Even in death, he is holding on. Even as his heart stops beating, his jaw refuses to slacken. It is a final act of defiance, a refusal to accept the reality of his own demise. He is the cigar boss until the very last millisecond and beyond. The flies return. They begin to buzz around the table, landing on the spilled salad, sensing the new feast that has been prepared for them. The sun beats down, indifferent to the tragedy. The heat wave continues. Galante is alone. The ambition that drove him from the tenements of Harlem, that carried him through the prisons and the exile in Montreal, that pushed him to claim the crown of thorns, it has all led to this. A dirty patio in Bushwick, a pool of blood, and a silence that will never be broken again. The king is dead. The kingdom is in ruins, and the only thing left is the smoke, drifting slowly away on the summer breeze, fading into nothingness. The click of the photographer's shutter was the period at the end of the sentence. The image of Carmine Galante lying dead in the garden of Joe and Mary's, the cigar still clenched in his teeth, did not just capture a murder. It captured the end of a mythology. For decades, the American Mafia had existed in a space of shadow and whispers, a secret society that seemed to operate above the laws of gravity and man. But this photo, splashed across the front page of the New York Daily News under the headline Greed, dragged the monster out into the harsh light of day. It was grotesque. It was tawdry. It stripped away the cinematic glamour of the Godfather era and revealed the ugly truth beneath. An old man in a polyester suit, bleeding out next to a plate of salad. The aftermath of Galante's death was not the restoration of order, as the conspirators had hoped. It was the opening of a Pandora's box. The violence that Galante had unleashed did not die with him. It metastasized. The Bonanno family descended into a bloody civil war, a chaotic struggle for the throne that would leave bodies in trunks and alleys for years to come. The discipline of the old country, which Galante had tried so ruthlessly to impose, evaporated. In its place came the cocaine cowboys of the 1980s, a generation of gangsters who had no code, only appetite. And watching it all, waiting in the wings with their own kind of patience, were the federal agents. The death of Galante signaled the beginning of the end for the five families. The brazenness of the hit, the public nature of the execution, galvanized the government. The RICO statutes, a legal weapon forged in the 1970s, were finally unsheathed. Within a decade, the commission would be dismantled, the bosses put in cages for life, the social clubs shuttered and seized. Galante had built a tower of gold, but he had built it on sand. And when the tide came in, it washed the whole castle away. We return now, in our mind's eye, to the cigar. In the hours after the shooting, the police removed the body. The cigar was taken from his mouth, tagged as evidence, placed in a plastic bag. Eventually, it would dry out, crumble, and turn to dust. It is a potent metaphor for the life of the man who smoked it. Carmine Galante spent 70 years chasing smoke. He chased the smoke of power, believing it was something solid he could hold in his hands. He chased the smoke of respect, believing it could be demanded at the point of a gun. He chased the smoke of immortality, believing his name would be written in stone. But power is not solid. It is fluid, slipping through the fingers the tighter you squeeze. Respect born of fear is not respect at all. It is hatred waiting for an opportunity. And immortality is a lie we tell ourselves to ward off the dark. Look at where it ended. Not in a palace, not in a state funeral, but on a dirty concrete patio in Bushwick, surrounded by flies. All the millions of dollars buried in basements, all the heroin shipped across oceans, all the enemies silenced. It bought him nothing in the end but a violent exit and a gruesome photo. The narration pulls back now, rising above the garden, above the rooftops of Brooklyn. We see the city of New York as it is today. The neighborhood of Bushwick has changed. The Italian enclaves are gone. replaced by a mosaic of new immigrants, artists, and young professionals. The social clubs where Galante's zips plotted in silence are now coffee shops serving oat milk lattes. The tenements where he learned to use a knife are now condos with doormen. The city is a concrete jungle, yes, but it is also a digestive system. It metabolizes its kings. It swallows them whole, digests their stories, and excretes them as folklore. Carmine Galante is no longer a man. He is a ghost story. He is a cautionary tale whispered by old men in the few remaining parks, a name invoked to explain why things aren't the way they used to be. Remember the cigar, they say. Remember the man who wanted too much. But even the whispers are fading. The generation that feared him is dying out. The city moves on, relentless and indifferent. The subways still screech through the tunnels. The lights of Manhattan still glitter in the distance. The noise of 8 million people drowns out the echo of the shotgun blasts. It begins to rain. Imagine the rain falling on the black screen of history. It starts as a few heavy drops splattering on the sidewalk. Then it picks up, a steady, cleansing downpour. It washes away the blood from the patio of Joe and Mary's. It washes away the chalk outlines. It washes away the memory of the fear that once gripped these streets. It seeps into the cracks of the concrete, finding the earth beneath, feeding the roots of new things that will grow in the spring. The money is gone, the empire is gone, the name is fading. All that remains is the silence. Not the silence of the zips or the silence of the grave, but the deep, abiding silence of time. It covers everything eventually. It smooths the rough edges of our lives. It turns tyrants into dust and tragedies into footnotes. Carmine Galante thought he was the author of his own story. He thought he could write the ending, but the pen was never in his hand. He was just a character in a much larger drama, a play about greed and gravity that has been running since the dawn of time. And as the rain falls, washing the stage clean for the next act, we are left with only the sound of the water, a gentle, rhythmic drumming that sounds like peace, or perhaps like forgiveness.